The Second Battle of Kiev describes 3 strategic operations by the Soviet Red Army, and 1 operational counterattack by the Wehrmacht which took place in the wake of the failed German offensive at Kursk during World War II. These 4 operations took place between the 3rd of October and the 22nd of December 1943. Overview. There, Manstein intended to rest and refit his troops, but that was not to be. When this was unsuccessful in October, the effort was handed over to the 1st Ukrainian Front, with some support from the 2nd Ukrainian Front. The 1st Ukrainian Front, commanded by Nikolai Vatutin, was able to secure bridgeheads north and south of Kiev. His opponent would be the veteran 4th Panzer Army, commanded by Hermann Hoth. The structure of the strategic operations from the Soviet planning point of view was Kiev Strategic Offensive Operation by the Central and Voronezh Fronts, Chernobyl-Radomysl Offensive Operation Chernobyl-Gorno-Stipol Offensive, Operation Lyatezh Offensive Operation Bukhron Offensive Operation Bukhron Offensive Operation Kiev Strategic Offensive Operation Rouse, November 1943 Counterattack Kiev Strategic Defensive Operation. First attempt. In October 1943, several of Vatutin's armies were having serious trouble trying to break out of the rugged terrain of the Bukhron Bend, the southern bridgehead. The 24th Panzer Corps of Walther Nering, in an effective defensive position, had the opposing Soviet forces squeezed in. As a result, Vatutin decided to concentrate his strength at the northern bridgehead at Lyatezh. The 3rd Guards Tank Army, commanded by Pavel Ryborko, moved northwards toward the Lyatezh bridgehead under cover of darkness and diversionary attacks out of the Bukhron Bend. Masses of artillery were shifted northwards, but the movements went unnoticed by the Germans. Initial stage of second attempt. Early on the morning of the 3rd of November 1943, the 4th Panzer Army was subjected to a massive Soviet bombardment. The German forces screening the bridgehead were defeated, and Kiev was quickly captured. The 1st Ukrainian Front's objective was to drive quickly westward in order to take the towns of Zhytomyr, Korosten, Berdichev and Fastiv, and to cut the rail link to Army Group Center. This would be the first step towards the encirclement of Army Group South. The plan went very well for Vatutin. Manstein, however, became worried. As Ryborko's tanks moved through the streets of Kiev on the 5th of November, Manstein pleaded with Adolf Hitler to release the 48th and 40th Panzer Corps in order to have sufficient forces to retake Kiev. The 48th Panzer Corps was committed to Manstein. Hitler refused to divert the 40th Panzer Corps, and replaced Hoth with Erhard Rouse, who was ordered to blunt the Soviet attack and secure Army Group South's northern flank and communications with Army Group North. A number of sources give the 6th of November as the date for the fall of Kiev. The 1st Czechoslovak Independent Brigade seems to have started the assault earlier, at 12:30 on the 5th of November, reaching the Dniepr at 200 on the 6th. After sweeping through the western suburbs of the city, and were the first unit in the city center, with Kiev finally being captured at 6:50 on the 6th. Rouse Counter-Attacks. Rouse was in difficulty with his units suffering heavy casualties in the initial stages of Vatutin's offensive. The 4th Panzer Army was reinforced, especially with artillery and rockets. The German divisions were bolstered on the 7th of November by the arrival of the newly formed 25th Panzer Division commanded by General der Panzertruppen, Georg Jauer. Its drive on Fastiv was halted by the 7th Guards Tank Corps. Ryborko was soon just 40 miles from Berdichev. Zhytomyr was taken by the 38th Army. The 60th Army was at the gates of Korosten. 40th Army was moving south from Kiev. The only respite for the Germans came where the 27th Army exhausted itself and went over to the defensive in the Bukhron Bend. The 4th Panzer Army was in deep trouble. However, the situation changed with the arrival of Hermann Balck's 48th Panzer Corps, comprising the 1st SS Division. 1st Panzer Division and 7th Panzer Division. Bork drove his forces north to Brusilov and then west to retake Zhytomyr. Ryborko sent the 7th Guards Tank Corps to counter the German assault. A huge tank battle ensued, which continued until the latter part of November, when the autumn mud halted all operations. Both sides had suffered heavy losses. The casualty ratio was fairly balanced, though the Soviets lost slightly more than the Germans. With the recapture of Zhytomyr and Korosten, the 4th Panzer had gained some breathing room. With Vatutin halted, Styuka released substantial reserves to his first Ukrainian front to regain momentum. Final stage of second attempt. By the 5th of December, the mud had frozen in the Soviet winter. 48th Panzer Corps conducted a wide-sweeping attack north of Zhytomyr. Catching the Soviets by surprise, the Germans sought to trap the Soviet 60th Army, and the 13th Corps. Reinforced with the 2nd Fallschirmjäger Division, the Germans drove eastward, putting the Soviets on the defensive. With Fastiv also being threatened, the 60th Army withdrew from Korosten. Vatutin was forced to ask Styuka for more reserves, and was granted 1st Tank Army and 18th Army. These new units, along with additional corps from other sectors, were hastily rushed westward. Thus, the Soviets stopped the German advance, went back on the offensive, and retook Brusilov. Both sides were exhausted by late December and the battle for Kiev was over. Aftermath. Although the Soviets had failed to break the rail link with Army Group Center or envelop Army Group South, they had conquered Kiev, the third biggest city in the Soviet Union, broken the Dnieper line, and inflicted significant casualties on the 4th Panzer Army. The Germans, for their part, had destroyed several sizable Soviet formations and kept the vital rail link open. But there was to be no rest. A few days after 48th Panzer Corps was pulled out to rest and refit, the Soviets launched their winter offensive on Christmas Eve. The renamed Voronezh Front offensive succeeded in pushing the Germans back to the 1939 Polish border by the 3rd of January 1944.